Good afternoon, everyone. And I'll tell you, it's wonderful to welcome you to this year's Distinguished Faculty Lecture. And it's truly wonderful to see so many of you here today. I've just been taking joy in having various members of the political science department over the years convene and see each other. I think it really is what Wellesley is about. And Kathy, thank you for giving us the opportunity to both celebrate you as well as those who are coming from the department. Established in 1999, the Distinguished Faculty Lecture is an opportunity for the college's accomplished faculty members to deliver a public talk that offers a window into their expertise and prompts us to reflect on the value of a liberal arts education. It's my great pleasure to introduce this year's speaker, Kathy Moon, Professor of Political Science and the Wasserman Chair of East Asian Studies. The title of her talk is Friending Your Enemy, Dialogue with North Korea, Engaging the Other. I would say that it's about as current a subject as we could wish for. Professor Moon is an extraordinary scholar and a committed and compassionate teacher. Throughout her remarkable career, she's tackled an impressively wide array of topics. Her teaching and research encompass international relations, the U.S. Korea Alliance, inter-Korean relations, socio-political changes in North Korea, democratization, nationalisms, migration and identity, and contemporary social movements in East Asia, to name just a few of her fields of expertise. With her dynamic range of scholarship, it comes as no surprise that Professor Moon is at work on multiple books. Currently, she's analyzing the impact of demographic change in South Korea and its implications for Korean democracy, and it's entitled New Koreans, Defectors, Immigrants, and the Future of Democracy. It promises to be the first book that examines through a political lens the thousands of economic migrants from Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, and North Korea who have arrived in South Korea over the past 3 decades. She's also editing North Korean Lives Matter, a volume of several interviews with members of the North Korean diaspora living around the world. When she's not at work on these projects or teaching, she is in high demand by CNN, Bloomberg, C-SPAN, and many other news outlets for her perspective and expertise on North Korea. Just last month, she was on NPR discussing the Trump-Kim summit in Vietnam. Deeply committed to women's rights, Professor Moon has served in the office of the Senior Coordinator for International Women's Issues in the U.S. Department of State and as a trustee of Smith College. Her book, Sex Among Allies, Military Prostitution in U.S. Korea Relations, explores how foreign policy decisions impact local communities, especially the lives of poor and marginalized women. Currently, she is also affiliated faculty at the Korea Institute at Harvard University and a member of both the Harvard Kennedy School's Korea Working Group and the National Committee on North Korea's Steering Committee. Throughout her work, Professor Moon moves deftly between domestic and international realms, illuminating the relationship between international relations and national politics and policy. This dialectic is imperative to understanding our current moment. We need a movement, but this current moment, and reflects the expansive spirit of liberal arts education. It is this comprehensive approach, her ability to detail decision-making at the highest level while also documenting its impact on the powerless, that makes Professor Moon's work so vital. She is able to bear witness to societies on a large scale without losing sight of the individuals who comprise them. In all her work, she has demonstrated commitment to human rights and gender equality as foundational to societal progress and social change. Professor Moon brings her deep knowledge to the classroom as an outstanding teacher. Since arriving at Wellesley in 1993, she has engaged our students in the most pressing questions and has included our students in her research. I'll just tell you, I have run into students last year as I was just milling around the campus, and a lot of things are happening in the world with regard to North Korea, and they describe Professor Moon as not only giving captivating lectures, but they talk about her habit of pulling together groups of students for impromptu discussions as world events unfold. We are so fortunate to call Kathy Moon ours, and we are thrilled to have you speak, Kathy, about an issue of critical importance this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming to the podium this year's distinguished lecturer, Professor Kathy Moon.
Thank you so much. I just told her, whispered in her ear, that was over the top. And this is fun. I don't get to see folks. I don't get to see my own colleagues outside of the few doorways next to me on a daily basis. So this is a real treat to see so many different faces, and especially those of you who came out of very precious environments called sabbatical, retirement, and who have come. I am really, really grateful, especially to members of the political science department here today, and to all of the students, and I see alums as well. Thank you so much. I, of course, extend my very, very heartfelt thanks to the President's Office. For those of you, especially students, who think that things just happen at Wellesley, there are so many people who work to make those things happen and do it invisibly and silently. So thanks to all of the staff and affiliated folks who helped to make the event possible, including members of the custodial staff. There was a gentleman vacuuming and making things spick and span at 4:15 today, and I was just, I was like, wow, this is a classy joint here, But I am grateful. And I especially want to recognize two of our students, my students, who are my research assistants, RAs. Annie Kim, who works with me on a variety of issues related to North Korea and South Korea, and who has helped me interview North Korean migrants who left or defected from the North. Annie, where are you? Annie's over there. And Megumi I'm so verklempt right now. Megumi Murakami, who has helped me on many, many projects, including the ones I mentioned, but also helped me put the PowerPoint together. I have never become so dependent on a student, and I must say that I really, really have counted on her. So you share in part of the credit. You want to just stand up, say hi? Okay, so North Korea. There's more that we don't know about North Korea than we do know. And so when people refer to me as experts, or when others refer to North Korea experts, I'm always scratching my head. Who are these people? Who are these North Korea experts? So I always have a question mark, because we need to be honest. We don't know much. Even those of us who think we do, we only think we do, because we don't really have much access. And so I think one needs to be humble when we study and do policy work on North Korea. And what we lack, especially in the policy arena, is humility. And I will talk about why we need to focus on that and in-depth learning. I have more faith in my students who will grow to become the practitioners, policymakers who solve the problems on the Korean Peninsula than anybody, any adult, any older adult in office today, or working in Washington, or in Pyongyang or Seoul, etc. So I really have hope for the next generation to solve these very pressing problems, because you won't have been tainted, hopefully, by a lot of the horrible ideologies and bigotries and the othering that have been too popularized and too politicized regarding the way we deal with North Korea. So friending your enemy. The DPRK, otherwise known as North Korea, it stands for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and as we know, among all communist states and post-Soviet era countries, whenever they refer to democratic, it's a misnomer, it's misleading, non-democratic, but nevertheless, the DPRK, or North Korea, has been an ardent enemy of the United States and South Korea, also known as the Republic of Korea, or ROK, for many decades since the Korean War in the 1950s. Technically, they all are at war with one another. That is, North Korea is at war with the South, and the North Koreans are still at war with the United States, technically, because there was no peace treaty signed in 1953 when there was an armistice or a ceasefire that became official. What's interesting now in recent years is this flurry of activity across the Pacific to try to set a course for friending one another. That is, the North Koreans trying to friend the South Koreans, and the North Koreans wanting Mr. Trump to friend them, and Mr. Trump wanting Mr. Kim to friend him. Mr. Trump has called Kim Jong-un a close friend, that they're in love. So, you know, for at least two of these guys, they're moving beyond friendship. But it's all rhetoric, of course. The issues are serious and unresolved. Nothing really has changed, despite the friendly rhetoric. Since early 2018, the two Koreas have been stumbling along, literally, trying to figure out how to transform their 70-plus year enmity into a process of reconciliation and possible unification. For those of you who are not aware, the two Koreas were separated in 1945 forcibly by outside powers as part of the beginning stages of the Cold War, and the two remain separated. So one people split asunder and families split asunder. My mom is here today, and she was born in what is now North Korea, or what used to be just simply Northern Korea, but she can never go to her homeland, her birthplace, because it's blocked because of the division, the militarized division between the two countries along the 38th parallel. So the two Koreas are trying to reconcile. Some people have hope, and some people are very cynical about the process. And recently, the South Korean President Moon Jae-in and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un had 3 summits, face-to-face meetings in 2018, and have been working on projects geared to bring peace and to develop a momentum for cooperation and peace. The U.S. recently joined the bandwagon of friending North Korea with the sole purpose of eliminating its nuclear weapons program. Donald Trump joined this bandwagon of summitry by meeting Kim in June in Singapore for a summit, and then recently in September in Hanoi, as President Johnson mentioned. The two leaders, Kim and Trump, met, and they're trying to find out how to become friends, but it didn't go too well in Vietnam. In February, Mr. Trump walked out and ended the meeting short of the scripted agenda and schedule, and the North Koreans also played hardball, demanding relief of the international sanctions that the United States and many of the UN countries refused to budge on. So it was considered a failure, although I personally don't see it that way. You can ask me why later. All of these three countries' leaders are finding that the road toward ending enmity is really difficult. It's full of obstacles, uncertainties, disappointments, and fears. So, how do we befriend an enemy? I ask that to all of you. When you think about individuals, enemies as individuals, enemies as groups of people, enemies as organizations or institutions, enemies as ideologies and ideas. How do we try to befriend an enemy? In international relations, whether the enemy is a person or a group, etc., the stakes are very, very high. The consequences of enemyhood can be deadly, leading to war, inflicting pain, death, devastation. The list can go on of horrible things. And we have plenty of these examples around the world. So when we're thinking about a path to ending enmity, I ask us to consider the following questions. First, how did we become enemies? Before you can think about becoming friends, you need to understand why you became enemies. People often forget why they became enemies. If you ask even people in family feuds for 3 generations, nobody can really tell you what the source, cause of that feud was. Second, how have we sustained enemyhood? Because maintaining your enemy requires work. It's not a natural process. Third, what do we fear in giving up the enemy relationship? Fourth, what will our own identity and interests be if we shift a relationship from enemy to friend? On a personal level, these are tough enough questions. On a state level, these are really, really tough questions. And unfortunately, states, governments, etc., do not have the willingness or the time or wherewithal or the capacity to reflect in the way that human beings might be prone to do. So today my folk will focus on these questions and is organized in the following way. Number 1, know thy enemy. Know your enemy. Number 2, how have we created the enemy and how has the enemy created us? I will focus on the U.S. and North Korea, although in my personal view, the 2 most important state actors in this peninsular politics, the Korean peninsula politics, are the 2 Koreas themselves. They have the most to lose and the most to gain. But today I'll focus on the U.S. DPRK dynamic. The second question, first question, know your enemy. Second, how have we created the enemy and vice versa? And the third is, how do we break this vicious cycle? And just a little hint to keep in mind, what the enemy does or does not do is not all about us. So we got to let our narcissism go. And my point here is that domestic politics often has a logic of its own. It's not always about international relations, international effects. So I'll move on to the slides. First, we need to know where we're talking about before we talk about what we're talking about. And because for most people around the world, the Koreas is, I don't know, it's an abstract idea. But if we look, the 2 Koreas are here, the North and the South. Just look at the expanse of land and ocean around the 2 countries. China, Russia, Japan. Of course, the U.S. is an East Asia Pacific power. This is a map that focuses on the Korean peninsula. It is linked to China and also to Russia up in the north. And if you look at the 2 countries, 2 states, it is an unnatural division at the 38th parallel. And what the Korean peninsula was for many, many hundreds of years in this region is a shrimp. South Koreans often talk about or refer to themselves as the shrimp among whales, right? I see some South Korean students nodding their heads. It's just such a cliche. These are the whales, obviously, Japan, China, Russia, and the U.S., right? Why the shrimp among whales? Because it is a physical conduit to the mainland of Asia, Eurasia, and it's so damn tiny compared to these large, great powers. And historically, it became sandwiched in between great power politics, and it is still sandwiched between great power politics. Nowadays, some people who study the Koreas, at least South Korea, say, well, at least South Korea is a dolphin among whales. It's more powerful, wealthier, etc. But nevertheless, the whole notion is this, that even if the great powers, the whales, are just frolicking, even if whales are frolicking in the ocean with no malicious intent, the poor shrimp is being turned upside down and swallowing water and basically dying. And that is how Koreans have felt historically. The most important thing for a researcher is to know, how can we know something? How do we get the information? How do we know the information is true, factual? How can we fact check that information? For North Korea, I can't give you clear answers. We have to do a lot of good, educated guesswork. And anybody who tells you otherwise is lying, and call them on it. I will let you know there are a few folks, few types of folks, genres of folks who do not lie, and they are the scientists. So this is a liberal arts college and a liberal arts lecture. You need the science, you need the scientists to rely on for certain facts. But in general, access to research is so difficult. How can we get information when we cannot go to North Korea freely? Even if we can go to North Korea, get in across the border, we can't move. We have no mobility around North Korea because of the surveillance and the monitoring by state security, especially of foreigners, but also of North Korean citizens themselves. We can't access North Korean citizens to interview or to do a field study of farms and cooperatives and how they actually work or don't work. We don't know how to access data sets because data collection in North Korea is utterly unreliable. And even if they have data, how do we know they're real? How do we know they're based on facts? Because they're usually not. The government will doctor them up. Archives? We can't get to North Korea for archives. At some point, like the former Soviet Union, I'm sure the North Koreans, when they can open up their society, will have to open up their archives. However, the question is, what will be in those archives? I don't know how much factual information we will get versus propaganda and doctored up documentation. Open source information is about the only thing we can count on. Information that's available to the public, usually through the internet, satellite imaging, etc. And of course, those in the governments will do intelligence gathering, but we can't as scholars, researchers, students. One group, the defectors, and I put them in quotes because most North Koreans who have left North Korea are not political defectors. That doesn't mean that they enjoy the human rights abuses or the malnutrition, but they are not all political defectors. The term defector is a highly politicized term, and people use it very loosely, and I don't. I usually put it in quotes. I refer to them either as North Korean diaspora or migrants. In some cases, they are refugees and asylum seekers. But if you talk to these so-called defectors, and I have for research, you have to be really careful because those of us who have studied people in exile know, and there's a lot of literature on this, you know that whether it's Cuban exiles, whether it's Venezuelan exiles today leaving Maduro's government, whether it's the former Soviet Union, exiles from there, they have a narrative that they tell. Everything's bad in the old country, nothing's good, and they're encouraged to tell these narratives because the governments and the countries and communities that are hosting them in their new land want that kind of politicized narrative. And so the North Koreans in South Korea know very well how to talk in interviews or to South Korean government officials about what the counterpart wants to hear. Another problem is many North Koreans are sick and tired of doing interviews, so it's very difficult to get access. They have what's called interview fatigue. And that's understandable. They have to answer the same questions over and over. When I speak to them, I do not ask them about the horrible life they have led. And they thank me because they say, we're so tired of talking about the horrible life. We have other kinds of lives too, but nobody wants to hear about them. So there are numerous problems even talking to people who are outside of North Korea. The one way I do my own research on North Korea is through history, so yay for historians, and through comparisons, case studies of other countries, societies that have gone through similar or comparable situations as North Korea. Number one, I look at North Korea not as a communist society, not as just simply a dictatorship, but as a post-colonial nationalist society. So you can borrow from post-colonial nationalist literature to understand the North Korean mindset. It's all about hating Japan, hating the United States as an imperial power, looking at South Korea as a puppet of the imperialists, and having national pride to redeem the society from the humiliation of Japanese imperialism and colonialism of 36 years on the Korean Peninsula, and also the awareness of the Chinese, Russian friends, allies, technically, of the North, who also seek their own interests in the North. So the North Korean nationalism is not just against the United States, South Korea, and Japan, but also ready at any time against the Chinese and the Russians as well. The other way I do the research is comparisons. East Germany and West Germany, through their unification process, taught us a lot about what to do and what not to do in terms of societal reconciliation or lack thereof, or how fast or slow to approach unification, because the unification question is the biggest and the bedrock question for the two Koreas in their own political dynamic. The nuclear issue is one of many issues that South Koreans are concerned with, but ultimately it is the question of unification. What to do about a country that was physically, psychologically, and family-wise divided? Can it be put back together, glued back? Probably not. Can it be joined together through a confederation of some sort? Possibly. Should there be an invasion of the North in order to absorb the North into the South's stronger capitalist economy? The North Koreans are scared to death of unification by absorption. That is what policy people call it, unification by absorption by the South. So, comparative work, I highly recommend it for those who are willing to try. The other way I look at North Korea is take anything about North Korea you can get and study it. I have a huge debt of gratitude to this college for financially supporting me through college funds to travel to North Korea in 2013 to do research. And I put the research in quotes. I actually went as a private tourist with a bunch of Canadian historians. If you're an American citizen, I highly recommend you travel with nice, kind, gentle Canadians. Anywhere in the world, but especially North Korea. As soon as you say, I'm with the Canada bus, they're like, okay, you're fine. If I had said, I'm with the America bus, I don't know. There was not an America bus. But I went with friends who are historians at Canadian universities, just about 6 of them. So we had this private seminar for about 11 days in North Korea together. And the historians, they know so much. Political scientists can't raise, I don't know. I mean, we come up to here compared to what they know. It's a humbling, but enriching experience. And I went with them because one of them had already gone to North Korea the year before via a private tour and was able to figure out which areas to skip, which tour sites to skip, which tour sites to try to add on. And they were filled with questions. We questioned the tour guides. You would think that you can't talk to North Koreans. You can. You just have to know how to talk to them. Don't clobber them over their heads. Don't be disrespectful. Don't point to them and say, your human rights problems. But listen, and then ask, and then help correct what they have wrong. And we were actually able to get museum guides who have their scripted narrative of the glorious history of North Korea step back when my historian friends kept asking questions. But I've also learned in my school days in America, many of them had studied in the U.S., that your President Kim Il-sung was not the first founder of communism on the Korean peninsula, which is true. Oh, yes, there are many ways to understand North Korea. So, you began to see this process at work. So engagement with the other, and with an other that has been steeped in propaganda, it is possible. But how you do it is the question. You can also engage soft drink cans. I was studying everything. We went to a restaurant, an Italian, quote-unquote Italian restaurant, where Italians had had taught the North Koreans how to make brick oven pizza, and I was thinking, this is surreal. And one of my colleagues ordered a can of Coke, and I thought, Coca-Cola, an American product in North Korea? An imperialistic capitalist product? Yes. So I turned the can around over and over. I was reading everything, and I came to this. It says www.coca-cola.it, Italy. And then that led me to say, why Italy? How Italy? So the Italians buy the Coca-Cola from the United States. They can them in Italy. They sell them to the North Koreans, but they don't sell directly to the North Koreans. They have many conduits. Right? Similarly, this is a can of fruit juice from Malaysia. Malaysia has a very active trade with North Korea, especially in things like beverages. And if you read this, it says, this is from the Pokka Corporation, Japan, product of Singapore, manufactured and distributed by Singapore. I'm sorry, this is Singaporean, not Malaysian, but Malaysia has a lot of fruit drinks in North Korea. Distributed by Hong Kong, imported by DPR of Korea. I was like, what is going on? I just saw somebody's mouth agape. That's how I was. So you have to be a sleuth and figure out step by step how many channels of trade were involved in getting this one can or a case of these products into North Korea. Conclusion, North Korea is not in the dark. It is not out of the circles of international trade. It just does it differently. So I learned to call it shadow globalization in North Korea. Sandals. Okay, to you it may look like nothing. To me, I was in shock because the North Korea that I had known about is highly puritanical. The North Korean women used to wear white tops and black dresses of the Korean traditional style. To have rhinestones and glitz and high heels on public streets in Pyongyang, the capital, this is capitalism. It's bourgeoisism. It's horrible. And yet, every woman I saw from age 14, someone who looked like a teenager in high school uniforms with the Kim Il-sung button, their communist badge, their nationalist badge, along with their red kerchief. They all have these shoes on. And they're in the subway stations posing, 14-year-old girls posing with their high heels and their stockings. And I said, how? Why? This is not the North Korea that's supposed to be. So I developed what my colleagues and friends decided was a foot fetish. I used to push them toward North Korean women, the guys especially. And I wouldn't take a picture of them, I would just take a picture of the shoes because I was fascinated. Where are these coming from? They're coming from China primarily. So all of the fancy stuff, North Koreans can't produce this yet, but it comes from China. The trade is active. Most consumer goods come from China. It's a lifeline. And here, this is in a fancy department store in Pyongyang. Fancy meaning it's very small, and the very, very elite of the elite of the elite can go because no one can afford it otherwise. But I was shocked. The variety of shoes for children, these are children's shoes, sandals, slippers, boots, rain boots. You could get it all. You could get the highest end German-made air conditioners, Dyson fans, vacuum cleaners. I'm thinking, why does a North Korean need a vacuum cleaner? Washing machines, it's all there. Just so you know, I don't have just a foot fetish. I developed a parasol fetish as well. North Korean women have become very, very enamored of their skin because they follow South Korean skincare by watching smuggled South Korean videos. And they watch all the soap operas, the movies, and the pop star singers. They all want great skin, so they all have these parasols. If I were to zoom into this, this is a very elaborate piece of work. And so I was standing literally right behind this young girl, student, and I am mesmerized, going, how do these people afford these parasols? Do they feel self-conscious with these parasols, given how bourgeois it looks and how ornate, right, and how frivolous? And of course, most likely they're made in China. And of course, most likely the women holding them are of the very, very elite. So you can learn a lot just by looking at parasols. That was my research. And then I started looking at ice cream trucks. So these are some of my Canadian friends. Our North Korean guide, North Korean vendor, North Korean buyer. What are they doing? We were getting ice cream. They were getting ice cream. And number one, I was shocked to see ice cream vendors in the middle of Pyongyang everywhere. Free agents. There's a market activity going on in North Korea. Very, very lively. Very rudimentary, but it is a market. And these North Korean women, very young women, had their baseball caps on with signs like, I love New York. And I'm thinking, what? Or Boss, the designer label for men's clothing, Boss. And thinking, okay. And then I looked at the ice cream case, because they peddle. It's a peddling business. Hair. I looked this up. It's Chinese made. So now I could start piecing together how vendors can earn money by using products imported from China and selling to customers, North Korean, mostly North Korean, but sometimes even foreigners. So you learn a little bit about small business or entrepreneurship this way. The other way we can know about North Korea is through real facts, and these are where different types of scientists come in. The United Nations and its many agencies, especially the World Health Organization, the World Food Organization, and some humanitarian groups that have been able to put people on the ground in North Korea, are able to come up with facts and figures that are reliable. And these are serious facts and figures. So you see the fancy parasols and the shoes. You also have a country that is highly malnourished or undernourished, with severe food shortages and with various health issues that come from food shortages, malnutrition, food insecurity, etc. One of the problems that we face in terms of policy right now is that the United States is not permitting food aid, humanitarian aid, to go into the north. That has been the case for under the Trump administration, and very recently there have been moves to shift that, to allow humanitarian aid in. But this is one area where some progress toward friendship, a gesture of friendship, can be made. And now here are other ways in which we can know North Korea factually by scientists, engineers, nuclear arms experts who are able to do the math in tracking the development of nuclear testing in North Korea and the kind of damage that the bombs can inflict. So as you note here, the yield and the damage, the destructive capacity by seismographs, basically, like the ones that monitor earthquakes, you can see that over time, it's increasing exponentially, so to speak. So we understand that we can get facts. We understand that North Korea is a threat. And that is why the United States is so hyper about trying to denuclearize North Korea and eliminate it as a source of nuclear proliferation, as well as an actual danger to the East Asia region and to the U.S. mainland. Here are the ballistic missile capacities. Again, over time, North Korea has been able to increase the distance that its missiles can travel. And these last two are the most important as far as the United States are concerned, because these are ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that hypothetically can hit the United States. I say hypothetically because I sleep very well at night. And I encourage all of you to sleep very well at night. Because a test might look like it succeeded does not mean that it can actually function, that that missile can actually travel out of space back into the Earth's atmosphere and then land at the target with the missile, the bomb, the tonnage intact. They're not there yet. We don't want them to get there. And here, why is North Korea considered a global threat? I was in London last June talking to some people at the British Foreign Office, and they talked about North Korea's missiles as a threat to Europe, Western Europe. And I thought that's a bit far-fetched. Technically speaking, if the North Korean missiles indeed can travel that far, then the two interballistic missiles, the most recent developments, portend that they might have capacity as far as Europe. But as people who study international relations and international security know, capability does not mean everything. Mere capability does not equal a threat. You have to have capability plus intent. Why on earth would North Korea want to send over a bomb, nuclear bomb, or nuclear missiles to Western Europe? Would North Korea actually destroy South Korea with nuclear weapons? My answer is no. Because there's nuclear fallout. It's suicidal. You hit South Korea, your enemy, you're going to destroy yourself, contaminate yourself, plus you will destroy the land south of you that is so prosperous, so wealthy, so full of technology, so full of the international conglomerates that are raking in the bucks, and that would have the intention of helping you, North Korea. If I were North Korea, would I seriously consider bombing Japan? No. Yeah, you were an imperial enemy, you colonized us, but you know what? The Japanese are fun to rattle, but the Japanese will always be the ones that North Koreans, South Koreans, and others will look to also for funding and for trade in the future. North Koreans are not stupid, contrary to some media portrayals of the North Korean leaders. They are very calculating. If I can be this calculating, trust me, there are 1,000 times more calculating. So they need to have the intention. The intention in terms of an actual threat the one country that might fall into this category is the United States. That does not mean that the North would actually lob missiles to the United States. But North Korea has an obsession with the U.S. as an enemy. And this is where the history becomes vital. We cannot understand North Korea's nuclear weaponry or anything about North Korea unless we understand history. North Korea, during the Korean War, was bombed to oblivion by the United States military forces. U.S. aerial bombing destroyed about 85% of all buildings, infrastructure in North Korea. This is a railroad system that was bombed. And the estimated civilian battle deaths are sky high. I looked at various sites and came up with this composite, an estimated 1 million people who died, about 10 to 15% of the entire North Korean population during 1950, the year the war started. And in terms of actual body count, an estimate of 800,000 men and 331,000 women who died by 1953. U.S. air bombing in Asia, let's compare. You might say, so what? The U.S. had air bombing practices, incidents elsewhere. All of the Pacific theater during World War II, less tonnage in bombs and napalm than in tiny northern part of Korea. North Vietnam, of course, dwarfs all else. In 2 years, this much tonnage of bombs and napalm, and Cambodia. But if you look at this, this is an unthinkable amount of damage on a tiny, tiny piece of land and population. So if that's history, this is today's sense of threat by the North Koreans from the United States. The U.S. forces and its allies in the region, this is a map, a chart that Megumi put together to give you a sense. The United States has permanently stationed troops and equipment in the ROK, South Korea, and in Japan, and in Guam. Immediate access to North Korea. If you think that that chart looked scary, imagine from North Korean eyes what this looks like. This is the entire U.S. Pacific Command at the ready to fight war in North Korea and to destroy North Korea. The numbers of ships, aircrafts, can't tell you what the capacity of those ships and aircrafts are. It's so much more than what we can put together as a composite number here. And in terms of actual personnel, it's over 400,000. And this is comparing force structure, the North Korean capabilities, South Korean, United States. South Korea has one of the toughest, strongest militaries in the world, very well equipped. Most of its equipment are interoperable with the United States. And so even if some numbers look thin, so let's look at tanks here. 3,500 North Korean tanks versus 2,614 South Korean. This is misleading because South Korean tanks are so much more dangerous and powerful and lethal than North Korean tanks, which have been rusting away since the 1950s. Another area of concern for the North Koreans, as well as the Chinese and the Russians, is what's called the high altitude aerial defense, or otherwise known as THAAD. When I was in Washington, I used to go to these meetings of U.S. policymakers, think tank people, and South Korean policymakers and think tank people, and I was new to all this, so I had to talk about a world of acronyms in Washington. I had to learn. And everybody at the table would say THAAD, SAD, DAD, TAD. And I thought, what on earth does this mean? It all meant the same thing, THAAD. But depending on who the South Korean was, they had trouble pronouncing the THAAD. Sometimes it was TAD, sometimes it was SAD, sometimes it was DAD. So, I had to learn how to translate the South Korean accent of THAAD. This is one of the most powerful missile defense systems in the world. And the United States emplaced 2 batteries on South Korean soil, much to the opposition of North Korea and of China and Russia. As far as North Korea goes, this system is intended to basically track and kill, destroy incoming North Korean missiles to the south. So for North Koreans, that means that hypothetically, their weapons they become impotent. So they're no longer a deterrent power, right? For the Chinese and the Russians, what they don't like is that THAAD has a radar that is so powerful that it can actually access military, nuclear movements, activities on their own soil, their territory. So they objected to that. So for North Koreans, this, as well as the U.S. force structure, the South Korean, Japanese force structure that I just showed you, add up to continuing threats. Not just historical threats, but continuing threats and a continuing reality of war. Here, this is a quick timeline of nuclear weapons development. And one question that often people ask is, why are the North Koreans developing nuclear weapons? It's a complicated answer, but I'll give you one reason for now, which is that we need to look at nuclear development in North Korea not as an activity unto itself, but as part of North Korea's industrial development since the 1950s, since the end of the Korean War. You might go, huh? Nuclear weapons, North Korea was interested actually even during the Korean War, toward the end of it. Apparently Kim Il-sung, the then leader, was toying with the idea of getting nuclear capacity for civilian use, nuclear energy. And then over time, in the late 1960s, after the Chinese had tested successfully their first nuclear weapon, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung went to Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, and said, hey, Mao, listen, you want to help us develop a military nuclear facility system in North Korea? And Mao said, go away. Mao said no. So the North Koreans then went to the Russians and said, hey, Moscow, do you want to help us develop, etc.? And the Soviets actually did help North Korea by providing North Korea with an experimental reactor and technicians from Russia in order to establish a civilian nuclear energy program, not military. However, the facility, Yongbyon Nuclear Facility, is exactly where the Soviet equipment got moved to and then transformed into the nuclear hotbed, the plant. So there is this continuity and other powers involvement. The U.S. knew of nuclear capacity, especially militarized nuclear ambitions, in the 1980s. One of the big questions that nobody's been able to answer and nobody wants to take up is, why did the U.S. know it and not do anything about it? And here, what I referred to, people get shocked. North Korea used to be quite well off. North Korea was, by the 1960s, the second most industrialized country in East Asia after Japan. North Korea had higher GDP rates, GDP figures, and standard of living and other indices of human welfare than South Korea. It's unthinkable today, given South Korea's power, wealth. But North Korea, until the early 1970s, was well ahead of the South. When I talk to North Korean refugees, migrants, they tell me that there was a song they used to sing in school, and I won't sing it for you, but it's a children's song. And it's a funny song that says, oh, this is a train. It's called like Chichi Bang Bang or something. It says, you know, get out of the way. I got to bring this train. I got to bring the goods, the cargo to South Korea to feed the little children there. The tables were turned at the time. And this is information about after the end of Japanese colonialism in 1945, the heavy industries being overwhelmingly residing in North Korea. The Japanese had set up North Korea as its industrial base. And this is just a quick test to make sure you're still awake. So 2 department stores, 1960s, 1973. Which is in which Korea? Somebody tell me? Anyone? I'm not going to pick on you, Sandra, because you probably know. I want people to guess. Which do you think belonged or was in which Korea, North or South? The left? North, South. Why? Okay, so the uniform gives it away. So obviously you know something about North Korea. But if you didn't know about the uniforms, next time I'll have to block out the uniforms. If you look at the building structures, they are pretty much the same. 1960s, 1970s. This is North Korea. Life expectancy in North Korea has not been low until the 1994-1997 massive famine, what we call the Great Famine of the North. The life expectancy plummeted in 1997 when you look at the various data. But until then, what's amazing is North Korea in 1960, on par. 1990, on par. And if you compare it to China in 1960, North Korea is way ahead. Even in 1990, way ahead of China. And if you look at these comparisons, you get an idea of 2015, age 71 versus age 66, 76 lifespan. North Korea is not doing badly at all in terms of life expectancy, even after the Great Famine. Per capita income. Singapore is one of the wealthiest in the world, outstripping the United States, its former colonizer, the UK, etc. But just in Asia, Singapore at the top, North Korea at the bottom, but very much in line with other developing countries, Pakistan and Ghana, and India, and it is not one of the poorest in the world. This is Pyongyang today, the capital city. Not all of it looks like that. There are slummy areas too, but there are high rises, and some of these places, a unit can go for $500,000 cash. If you want to know how they get it, I'll tell you later. They're very proud of what they've achieved because if you recall the photograph of the railroads that were bombed and that nothing was left in North Korea, they built this up on their own. China was not helping them until the Soviet Union fell. They did have Soviet aid. And this is called Mide, Future Scientist Street, a way to celebrate North Korean scientists, nuclear engineers, technology, computer scientists. This, they believe, is the wave of the future. So they are very, very ambitious, incredibly proud of their achievements. Why is this related to nuclear weapons? Because nuclear weapons, despite how we caricature North Korea, nuclear weapons represent a natural outgrowth of North Korean industrialization and their self-identity as a state that arrived. It had once arrived. It had once been successful. It was once considered a jewel of the communist world, believe it or not. And so it's not so far-fetched in their mind to want this kind of power and attention and leverage. In our minds, it looks ridiculous. And of course, how do we create and sustain enemyhood? This is partly how. We belittle, we caricature, we put buck teeth, the traditional racist, anti-Asian racist trope on Kim Jong-un, who does not have buck teeth at all. And if he had buck teeth, he would have enough money to be able to correct those buck teeth, okay? Why does he have buck teeth? His tiny nuclear button versus, as Trump said, he has a bigger nuclear button. This is actually to make fun of Trump, who said, my button's bigger than yours, to Mr. Kim. But it gives you the sense, the New Yorker, I think this is a brilliant, brilliant piece of propaganda art, right? Of baby, little, tiny, young Kim Jong-un, only 33, 34-year-old, playing with nuclear weapons and playing with death and destruction and war. This man is not a baby. Yeah, he's still chubby, but he's not a baby, and he is not stupid, and he is a highly calculating person who has been using the nuclear weapons to his country's advantage. It also keeps him and the Kim family in power. And this is where the domestic politics, nuclear weapons as domestic legitimation, is important, which many people who work on policy in Washington, Seoul, etc., do not factor in. Nuclear weapons are important to the North Korean regime because it gives them power and legitimacy. It gives them something to lord over their own people and tell their people, we are powerful. We have weapons, the best and worst kind of weapons in the world, just like the great United States. And here I move to quickly images of how North Korea creates and sustains enemyhood with the United States. North Korea is the most militarized society that I know, and I have studied militarism and militarization for, 30, 35 years. Everything is militarized. So this is an annual flower show that features two rare species of flowers of the begonia family and the orchid family, named after the first leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, and then his son, Kim Jong-il, who's the father of the current leader, Kim Il-sung이야 and Kim Jong-il이야. And I am a gardener and I love flowers. I was so excited. I thought, I'm going to see something so rare. Forget the politics. I just want to see the flowers. Boy, was I disappointed. Just big red begonias and, a regular Phalaenopsis orchid. But the fanfare around it, this place I went to is a huge hall. And people sent in exhibits like we have in March, the March flower exhibit in Boston. People sent in and shipped in and transported in flower exhibits from all these different communal groups, etc. And every single one of them has something that refers to militarization. Have you ever seen gnomes in gardens? Yes. Sometimes Catholic families have St. Mary statues out in their garden. I have never seen nuclear missiles next to flowers. But in North Korea, it's normal. Here, a student taking pictures. And I use this because to show how normal this is. It's like going to the Statue of Liberty in New York or going to Faneuil Hall and just taking a picture, right? This was our tour guide, donned in her best. And I asked my female handler, tour guide, she's part of this whole building. And I said, since when did women start wearing such fancy the traditional Korean garb? And she said, the time that she told me was a little bit before Kim Jong-il came to office, which tells you things do change in North Korea. And here, this was an exhibit celebrating children, not only North Korean children, but children of the world. It had flags from everywhere around it. And this is all part of a continuum. Children playing, doing exercises, a dove symbolizing peace, and oh, by the way, a rifle here and there. These were mini statues. They were really pretty. And I was so excited to take photos until I saw the military weapons on these kids, right next to the, quote, dove of peace. This is all very normal. To me, I had such psychological cognitive dissonance going on in my head. I watched the North Koreans, nobody bat an eyelash. It's all normal. It's okay. More. And literally, war is monumentalized in North Korea. Everywhere you go, the public monuments are larger than life size, as was the Soviet, the communist tradition of art. And some of it is quite beautifully done. I stared into so many of these faces as best as I could, climbing up as high as I can. There's some of it's beautifully done, but everything is to glorify war and North Korea as both victim and survivor and victor. And so if you grow up in a society where you're just eating, drinking, breathing war and militarism, that to me is the largest challenge of how to friend North Korea. Once you denuclearize North Korea, let's say we do that tomorrow. Let's say we sign a peace treaty with North Korea. How do you change people's mindsets? How do you change people who have normalized and internalized these things and internalize the enemy, the United States, South Korea, and work with them? This is a parade, a military parade I just happened to walk into, right in the middle of Pyongyang. These are onlookers waving, soldiers, apartment buildings. And yet this is, to me, the authentic North Korea or Northern Korea. If you look from afar, without all the militarism, there could be little non-gnome missiles somewhere in those home gardens, family garden plots. But from here, this is what North Korea looks like. And so I end with this. How do we stop the vicious cycle of creating and sustaining enemies? Ask yourself this in your own life. And ask yourself this when it comes to the studies that you do. We need fewer high-level symmetry between leaders. Mr. Trump should stay in Washington. Mr. Kim should stay in Pyongyang and stop wasting taxpayers' money or whoever's money. What we could use more of is people-to-people exchange. The U.S. government can get rid of the travel ban that it placed on American citizens going with American passports to North Korea. We could try to work with North Koreans through exchanges. The UK started exchange programs one way, getting North Koreans into Cambridge University, giving scholarships to study English to North Korean defectors, refugees in South Korea. Humanitarian aid, medical aid, absolutely critical. And we're not talking anything fancy. We're talking tuberculosis, trying to take in medicine for TB to prevent the spread of TB in North Korea, which can spread to South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, etc. Food aid. Also, to resume the kind of activities that the U.S. once did back in the early 2000s by having the U.S. New York Philharmonic travel to Pyongyang to give concerts and master classes to North Korea with North Korean musicians, classical musicians. That trip has not been reciprocated, and it was part of a deal. But these people-to-people exchanges have become trapped, held hostage by the larger politics. And I think these, what I call smaller steps, these people-to-people steps, would go a longer way to building a firmer path or a clearer path and a firmer road to cooperation, possible peace, maybe even a peace treaty, than the kind of steps that many policymakers are engaging in. And the last question I leave you with is, so let's say we denuclearize. Let's say we are able to do that. What happens to actually rebuilding a society, to re-educating a people, to reconciling not only North Koreans and South Koreans, but reconciling North Koreans to the rest of the world? So that will be your job, those of you who are in your 20s or younger. I'm off the hook in that category, as are my contemporaries. And I leave you with this photograph of, hopefully, a future for North Korean children. And I did not choose a photo of girls without focusing on girls. Hopefully a future for North Korean children and South Korean children and others, where they can smile, laugh, make friends, and possibly even use Facebook to friend other people outside of their country. Who knows? Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for really just an extraordinary lecture that really, I think, leaves us with more questions that are so critical, quite frankly, as you said, not only to North Korea, but I think it's fundamental to our world, the paradigm that you've set up. We're going to open it up to questions, and Professor Moon actually asked me to do this in an interesting way that I think is terrific, which is that we're going to take a few questions at a time so that she can then kind of weave them in to an answer. But I'm going to take my prerogative and ask you a question that you started with and said you'd answer it, okay. Which is, you said that the meeting between Trump and Kim in Vietnam actually wasn't a total failure. What are your thoughts on it?
It's an important question because there were so many people, and still the media, the U.S. media in particular, looks at it as a failure. Part of it is a way to bring Trump down, because people have a desire to do that. But also because there are a lot of skeptics about this whole process. I look at the actual so-called failure as a success. I think the best thing that could have happened is for the Hanoi meeting to break down because of the following. Number one, it showed Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim the truth that two individuals cannot create peace, cannot denuclearize North Korea. It just cannot happen. And that means that working level groups, working level people, the ones who actually are the experts on the nitty-gritty technical issues, have to be in place constantly with a counterpart at it for months and months at a time. Okay? It's not going to happen through one meeting, two meetings, etc. The other reason is that this allowed the South Koreans to step back. Because the South Korean president, I've not talked much about South Korea, but South Korea is way ahead of the U.S. in trying to find this road toward friending North Korea. And in my view, it's going way too fast. And I think South Korea had high hopes for the Hanoi meeting and thought once some success comes out of it, then the South Korean programs can just start flying, joint projects and all this with the North. And I think the South Koreans needed to slow down. So in that sense, I think it's better. So I look at the failure in Hanoi as really the start of real negotiations, which is the tough negotiation, not the fanfare and the photo ops, but the nitty-gritty homework that needs to be done.
Great, thank you. Questions? We'll take a few. Yes.
I have a real question, which is, what can we learn about the possibilities between North and South Korea from the reunification of Germany? And then I have another question, which is, are those spankly high-heeled shoes really progress?
We can talk about the Coca-Cola, too.
The German unification has lots of examples. And what most South Koreans took away from the German unification is to not unify quickly because the economic costs are way too high. And so that's one simple answer. I think also, I'm also studying as a research paper issues of land adjudication. What is going to happen to North Korean territory, land that used to belong to private owners, landowners, whether in the north or now in the south, if there's access to be able to claim that land once North Korea, quote, opens up. So even on land issues, land adjudication, Germany is studied as a model, but Germany is a model not to follow in that category because of the way Germans went about it versus Hungary or the Czech Republic, etc. So not only Germany, but also the former Soviet Union can serve as different types of models, good and bad, with the examples. Also issues of divided families. How do you get them back together? How do you make them find one another, right? After decades of being lost in terms of documentation or memory, etc. So there's just so many questions. And indeed, the comparisons with Germany and with other post-Soviet countries can be useful. The high heels, yes, I wouldn't call that progress for women per se, but it is an easy way to mark changes going on in a society that many people view as changeless, as frozen in time. And the way that many people look at North Korean people as robots, automatons, that only do and think and act the way they're told, absolutely not the case, right? I mean, when I saw those shoes, I said, so what kind of a battle went on between that teenage girl and the parents about wearing those shoes, right? The same battle that might go on anywhere else in the world, right? Teenage rebellion, teenage wanting to show off. So in that sense, they're both human like the rest of us, and also changes are happening.
Any other? Yes, Gordon.
So I've got, thanks for that wonderful talk, and I've got a very concrete question and a question that's a little more conceptual. The first, how exactly did the DPRK become so much more prosperous than South Korea by the 60s when so much of its infrastructure was destroyed between 1950 and 1953? So that's my more concrete question. My more conceptual question is regards you mentioning, or really talking about the deeply culturally embedded militarization of North Korean culture. And it put me in mind of, I'm sure this is quite common for an academic, it put me in mind of my own work on the same. And one of the things it made me think of was the fact that the crusading mindset, the East-West divide, went on for hundreds of years, from about 1095 through about, really through the 1600s. And the only thing that really changed that mindset was the degradation and sort of splitting apart of the hegemonic force behind it, the Roman Catholic Church. Because of the rise of Protestantism and the discovery of the New World and colonialism, etc. Are there any hegemonic forces that sort of ride in the background that you could identify as the thing that might have to break down before that North Korean militarizing mindset could break down behind it?
Loaded questions. Okay, I'll go with the second one first, okay, because that's a big question. And I'll try to make the answer relatively small. One of the biggest problems, the main rationale for the North Koreans to maintain such hyper-militarization and hyper-militarism is because of this fear of the United States. I showed you all of the numbers, the forces, and the history. That doesn't mean that the U.S. is out to clobber North Korea, okay? I don't think the Americans at all want to get involved in North Korea. There's no military person in Washington in his or her right mind who would want to do that. However, the North Koreans don't believe that. The North Koreans are sure that the U.S. has always wanted to destroy North Korea. And so they constantly ask for security assurances in writing that you will not invade, you will try to live peaceably with us. And what did Kim Jong-un want from Trump? He wanted, again, the repetition of the same requests for decades and decades. Assurances about North Korea's security and stability. So one of the main problems is the large U.S. military presence in East Asia, U.S.'s own militarism. And I say this is a real problem or conundrum because many people don't want to proceed with denuclearization, even if they say they do in the United States, because once you do, the North Koreans will then inevitably be demanding that U.S. troops, the U.S. bases, military bases in South Korea be removed. The South Korean public may also demand that South Korea no longer host U.S. military bases troops. Because if the North were to denuclearize and also, let's say they agreed on reducing their conventional weaponry, non-nuclear weaponry, then the rationale all begins to fall apart for this maintenance of enmity and military preparedness. For the United States, having U.S. bases and personnel in South Korea is not only to, as a form of deterrence, to prevent the North from invading the South, but it is also it has increasingly become part of the U.S.'s military posture to prevent China from military expansionism. So this is a very complex web of different types of military and militarized interests. If you reach denuclearization, if North Korea were to reform, will the U.S. necessarily recede from the picture militarily? My answer is no, at least in the immediate to near to medium term. And that in and of itself will create problems for the region to deal with. So you're absolutely right about these hegemonic forces. And North Korea, the flip side is, powers also play with the hegemonic forces. They get as much out of them as they want, right? North Korea wants to use China as a foil against the United States, use Russia as a foil against China. And it's doing a really good job lately, meeting with everybody. North Korea's diplomatic activities have just skyrocketed since 2018. And this is exactly what they're doing. They are playing the hegemonic powers against one another, or at least to just protect themselves, hedging their bets. I can't speak to, I hope that North Korea, the peninsular politics do not become problematic as long as the Crusades were. But I do foresee that it would continue to be a problem for decades to come, even if we didn't have this nuclear problem with North Korea. That's the shortest way I could go, or the simplest way. Good question. And your first question?
How did the DPRK become so wealthy?
Yeah.
Shortly after the Korea?
Very simply, we have to look at South Korea first. Why did South Korea do so poorly? South Korea had so much U.S. economic aid and military aid. It kept South Korea afloat after the war. After it became an independent state in 1948, before the war, after the war, etc., poor leadership in South Korea. So in South Korea was a dictatorship, military dictatorship from 1961, 62 to 1987, 88. So a lot of the stuff you hear about human rights violations in the North, when I read them side by side with documentation from the South, they almost sound and look identical. But the military dictatorship, especially of President Park Chung-hee from 1962 to 1979, he is considered the developer, economic developer of South Korea. I will not say that, that having a dictatorship was worth the economic development, but in the case of South Korea, they got several things right. Prior to that leadership, the first leader, the President Syngman Rhee, it was just stereotypical developing country problem of corruption, rentism, rentier state, etc. So just squandered the economic aid and all other resources. As far as North Korea goes, to its credit, lot of sacrifice on the part of the people. Forced land collectivization, which can be very, very violent. And a lot of deprivation, but a lot of hard work, as well as aid from the Soviet Union. And blueprints for factories, et cetera, infrastructure straight from the Soviet Union. North Korea was no different from any other developing country at the time in either independent parts of Africa or elsewhere, who sometimes looked to the Soviets for the development model.
Kathy, thank you. You have just, this was brilliant. I think so much food for thought for not only the Koreas, but clearly for the world, and how fortunate we are at Wellesley to have you with us leading the way.
Thank you.
This is for you. Please join us for a reception over at the Davis just across the courtyard.
Thank you very much.